some insight into that I can just pass along while Dr. Faykosh begins. But if not, we'll just keep going as best we can.
And hopefully we'll get to, I see anonymous attendee, we'll get to your question. And so we'll try to save questions kind of towards the end. And we do have Dr. Span, who's I think one of those people trying to get in as well, who's going to be here for some ideas and thoughts as we go along too. And yes, if you do have any suggestions for ways that you were able to get in that maybe we're not, we don't know about, then certainly let us know. Otherwise, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So a lot of this, I think we're learning is going to inevitably be tied, of course, you know, to George Floyd and what happened last Monday, as many of us were enjoying Memorial Day. Just some basic information. I'm sure the majority of us are kind of aware of the situation. George Floyd was arrested for what they accused him of as counterfeit currency. He was, it doesn't appear from the videos that I've seen, was not resisting arrest at all, and instead was held to the ground with an officer's knee against his neck. The autopsy, I believe yesterday, revealed that, or maybe it was the day before, revealed that he died of asphyxiation, so choked to death or was unable to breathe. And the officer had his knee to George Floyd's neck for 8.5 minutes to 9 minutes. And that's the kind of overarching. He has since been arrested, the arresting officer, Derrick Span, and then the three other officers, sorry, have also been arrested since this. And Chauvin's charge has been moved up to second-degree murder, I believe, and then second-degree manslaughter. And if that's changed in the last half hour to hour, certainly let me know. I'm not always aware of like the difference in sentencing, so if I'm wrong, please forgive me there. So this this incident kind of set off then a huge outcry. And again, the idea of how we process this, you've been alive in the last 15 years, you've seen other incidences. One of the things we've been talking about, what you see happening is, you know, it's being videotaped, right? We're being recorded. And that hasn't necessarily removed the idea that this violence is still happening. And so in the case of George Floyd, many of us got the video within the hours that it happened. And the idea that a man can be killed in broad daylight, and that it took a while to get the 4 officers to be charged, does feel like a miscarriage to a lot of people. And so we'll go through some of the other, to my mind, tangential events, and then get into the protests, which is also what we're going to be focusing on. It's important to note, a lot of the outcry, a lot of the anger is hinging on the idea of police brutality, right? This is not the first incident. This is not likely the last incident. And what we've seen over the last week is instead other examples where it appears that people are being kind of mishandled by the police, and that's not what we want out of the police. And again, full disclosure, we're not here to bash the police. I don't have solutions necessarily to, you know, what we are going to do about the police. I am at a loss, I think, just as so many of you are as well. And if you're angry, you're allowed to be angry. To me, the incident that happened to George Floyd is, I'm unable to disconnect it from other incidences. Earlier that same day, we were processing an incident from Central Park in New York City where Christian Cooper, a bird watcher, gets called, the cops get called on him for, in the words of Amy Cooper, threatening her, and large African-American man is threatening me, is what she claimed. There's, of course, going to be a big discrepancy between what she felt and what his intentions were, but the fact remains that her instinct was to call the police. And it's, I remember feeling relieved that nothing happened to them by the time the police showed up at Central Park. The both individuals were gone, and that nothing more happened. But then later that night, we see where something does happen, and again, we're still trying to process that in real time. For a lot of people, there is a connection as well with injustice in Louisville, Kentucky, where a young nursing student had the police break through her door. Breonna Taylor, she ended up getting shot, I believe, 8 times by the police. And so Louisville, there is certainly a feeling about what happened to George Floyd being an injustice. They're also processing their own grief, their own outcry, their own emotions from what's happening to Breonna Taylor as well. And those will be intertwined. We're months away from an incident in Georgia, in Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed while jogging. There is all sorts of, again, conjecture about what he was doing and whether the people in the community who ran for their guns, whether they believed they were in harm or if it was acting out of malice. Earlier today, one of the defendants was believed to have used a racial epithet when chasing down Ahmaud right after he'd been shot. And again, that is something we're still processing right now. So again, Georgia might be very well, might have a lot of this outcry over George Floyd, but it's also tied to Ahmaud and numerous other incidences that we're seeing around the country. We are living in the time of the COVID panic, where there's all of these different ideas about what the government is doing, whether people are being locked in their houses and having their rights taken away, that it is disproportionately affecting African Americans, that healthcare remains one of those issues that divides us as a country, that if you are African American or a minority, you are in all likelihood going to have less access or greater obstacles to getting the same kind of healthcare and treatment that other people would be able to enjoy. We saw where armed protesters were on the State House steps in Michigan, in Ohio, and in other states, and the police, took that criticism, took those protests, and didn't react with violence, didn't hit them over the heads, didn't use tear gas or pepper balls or whatever they're calling it at this hour. That is also kind of playing into this as well. So what we've seen then in the next week and in this most recent week is then a week of protests and a week of rioting and a week of vandalism and looting, and no two situations are the same. We have seen where in some cases they are peaceful protests. We have seen in some cases where there is outright vandalism, outright looting happening. And that is something that is going to be difficult to kind of separate, right? For the peaceful protesters, there is a need for people to be able to channel their peace. We are a country, I'm a historian, and I should have said that at the beginning for those of you who don't know me, I do teach history. We're a country that we pride ourselves on being protesters, right? The revolution, we call it the Great Revolution, the American Revolution, that is who we are, that we couldn't take any more oppression from the British and King George. And yet we have this perception that protesting has to be done a certain way or else it isn't being done properly. Our country, when we think about the Boston Tea Party, one of those moments that you will find in every single early American history textbook, that was outright destruction of property. And so when you see some of the images of peaceful protesting, I don't know what people's issue is with that kind of protesting happening. But people do have a bone to pick with it. This is not just about the damage. I do want to make that clear. There is, of course, riots. There is, of course, looting happening. I want to be very clear, though, it's not just the people connected to the movement, people who are in grief, who are doing the destruction or doing the looting. We are seeing where there are people taking advantage of the situation. And you will have that all the time, right? We had people taking advantage of the COVID crisis, people who wanted to enrich themselves off of people's panic and people's insecurity. This was going to happen no matter what was happening this week. There were going to be crimes committed. These, again, are being videotaped, they're being recorded. And we are seeing in real time how that is impacting a lot of people. And I want to be clear, I'm not endorsing looting, but the idea that people are feeling helpless and frustrated, you know, when I have my nephews and nieces around, one of the first things they do when they're upset, when they're very little, and hopefully not too recent, they break things, right? You do that not because you hate everything and want to see the destruction of the world around you, but because you are frustrated. You have reached your breaking point. I always hated the idea of having to pick up after myself, so like I'm not going to add to it by, you know, creating a huge mess. But I get it. I get that there is destruction that happens when these things go on. Some questions that are raised by the protests that we have are about the impact of far-right groups trying to exacerbate this. You might hear about the Boogaloos, this group of people who want to see a larger protest so then they can use it to kind of fulfill their race-filled fantasies about this division in our country. And it does kind of then go back to this kind of law and order mentality. We have indisputably seen police violence, not just in the inciting incident with George Floyd, but also on the streets. Now, the justification for it is that the police themselves are being met with violence, that they're having things thrown at them. And again, not an endorsement, but there is an imbalance when it comes to the police who are armed, who have weapons, who have all sorts of different, implements at their disposal, and people who are in the streets and who are, again, kind of grabbing out of frustration. We have seen protester violence, so violence that the protesters are doing. There is damage being done, there is vandalism, there is the looting, there is the destruction of property. Regardless of your feelings about Donald Trump, the idea of seeing the White House go completely dark, the idea of there being fires set in multiples of these cities, it's a disturbing thing, and I get where people are going to be very upset and, again, reacting out of fear. And then, of course, targeting journalists. It's no surprise in a country where we hear about fake news all the time that you would see violence being visited on journalists in this country, and it is real. You'll hear again where that's going to be exaggerated, that kind of thing. It isn't. It's happening. It's being videoed. You know, we're seeing that happen as well. And then it's, again, you cannot unlink the fact that regardless of how you feel about Donald Trump, we are seeing where his actions and lack of action and overreaction is going to be fodder. It is a job he signed up for, by the way. It is something he campaigned on, this idea of being a law and order president. And so it is not a surprise, I think, to most of us to see where that kind of attitude and posture is going to be met with resistance. And we're seeing, again, that really happen in real time. Regardless, again, of how you feel about him, this is going to be a kind of lynch point for a lot of people about how they process this. Just to give us some context and give you some reading material if you're so interested in what we're seeing, you know, I saw when Ahmaud Arbery was killed, and then with George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, people using the term lynching. We did a whole panel in the fall on the idea of kind of what we call public lynchings in today's day and age, where people are being extra legal, happening outside of the justice system, punished in broad daylight. And it can happen in terms of people losing their jobs and people finding their livelihood affected. But most importantly, what we're talking about is the real violence being brought to a lot of African Americans still here in the year 2020, where their humanity is on the line. We had lynchings, over 4,000 incidences that have been cataloged. Those are the ones that we're aware of. If you're interested in more about lynching here in the United States, there's a great article that the Equal Justice League has put together, and that link's at the bottom. You can type in ejl.org/reports/lynching in America, and see all of these different incidences and kind of decide for yourself if that connection is apt. Some other examples, one of the things that came to mind when people got very verklempt about the notion of violence and destruction is the Tulsa race massacre of 1921, where a group of African Americans who were doing it, making it in the city of Tulsa, found themselves then completely destroyed. Just this week, they found what they believed to be a mass grave from the aftermath of Tulsa. And this happened 99 years ago this week, where Greenwood, this neighborhood of Tulsa, was completely leveled and destroyed by the police and by white neighbors. And if you've never heard of it, there's a reason. We don't talk about it a lot. I try to in my classes. I try to make sure that doesn't continue. But we as a country still are having a hard time kind of coming to grips with what it means when violence is happening to people who were repeatedly marginalized throughout our history. Detroit has been hit multiple times. There is the Detroit race riots of 1943, the Detroit riots of 1967, and all of them are going to be about the idea of Black mobility. African Americans moving north after the Great Migration during World War I, and when jobs get scarce, people get fearful and visit this cruelty on their African American neighbors. A great article is called Detroit's Great Rebellion, and you can see the link at the bottom. If you just type in Detroit race riots of 1943, you'll find a whole slew of great information on those riots. In one of my other classes right now, they're writing about the aftermath of the Martin Luther King assassination in 1968 that happened in April after Martin Luther King, who was a peaceful, was always kind of pushing the envelope in terms of advocating for the different movements within the civil rights movement, but always encouraging his supporters to do it peaceably. And he was shot in the face. You're going to, and have likely seen a ton of quotes of Martin Luther King Jr. And I always want to add in and he was also shot. He's also killed. His own daughter this week, she called out somebody who was trying to lecture her on her father and said, one, the people who are using his quotes right now sometimes misremember the fact that he was one of the most hated men in the United States. In a poll in 1967, I don't have the exact poll, that he was one of the most hated men anywhere. He was dogged by the FBI. He had been stabbed before. He had seen his other leaders killed around him, and he himself was killed. So do not believe for a second that he was an angel that was brought to earth and then got to ascend back into heaven. He was murdered in broad daylight. His assassin, most people don't recognize, was loose for months before he was finally apprehended. And so there's going to be riots. There's going to be an outcrying of emotion. In most of our lifetimes, the one we remember is the Rodney King riots, the race riots of 1992 in Watts, California, and the Los Angeles race riots. You can type in all of those different keywords if you want more information. To me, the best source for this, I was just watching it earlier, was the documentary called OJ Made in America. Part 2 is all about some of these moments that kind of lead up to his own situation, but they go into great detail about, again, the different kind of simmering tensions that then lead to this explosion of violence. When I first started teaching in 2011, when we talked about the Rodney King riots, I always felt like, well, this is what happened back then, and then things got better. We had just elected our first African-American president. Here we are, 9 years later, and ladies and gentlemen, this has not gotten better. One of the tropes I do want to make you aware of and at least have a vocabulary about, you've likely seen it, is saying that the victims, there's often this rush to try to excuse violence that is visited upon the victims by saying some form of the phrase, they're not a choir boy, and bringing up anything that they have done in their schooling, crimes that they may have committed in their past. Most of us have things that we're not proud of, and most of us still enjoy the idea that the justice system works in our favor, that we want to believe that we get a fair trial. If you believe that, you cannot like the idea that not every citizen feels that same way in this country. And so if you think that each of the people who have been killed by the police were guilty of a crime, then let that play out in court. Let them get their day, let them get a jury of their peers and a lawyer, and let's see that play out. And instead, what we're seeing happening is that extralegal process. This is happening before they get to the courtroom, before they get representation, before they get to defend themselves. It's happening, it's happened, it's going to continue to happen unless we find ways to address it and try to do that peacefully. Here are just the fatal shootings by police since 2015. The red dots indicate somebody who was unarmed. The black dots, of course, are somebody who had a weapon of some sort. So don't believe for a second this is only happening in major cities. Don't believe for a second this is only happening when the person is violent or has weapons on them. This is something that we need to address and something that we're hopefully going to do a better job of. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Rath, who's going to take over the second part.
Thank you, Dr. Faykosh. I want to start by just saying, having a knowledge of that historical perspective behind any tension or any conflict is really where the beginnings of understanding can come into existence. And as a professor of communication studies, that's what I do here at Central Arizona College. It's really my life's passion to ensure that we all learn how to improve our communication skills so that we can not only restore, but also maintain those relationships that we have with other people. So today, this historical perspective that Dr. Faykosh provided and give you a communication perspective through the lens of conflict transformation. So to begin, I think it's really important that we all need to understand the basic reason, or the most basic reason for why people protest. Dr. Faykosh, I don't think I can move the slides. Would you mind? Thank you. So if you look at this first point, people often act or react as a result of conflict that they're feeling because of their innate desire to be heard. And it's really interesting because the human psyche is one where if you feel unheard, then that's equivalent to being unloved or feeling unimportant. When we're unseen, unheard, we feel invisible. And as humans, that is the equivalent to being debased. And this can happen at a micro or a macro level, which we're seeing in today's protests, where people of color feel like their voices have been ignored long enough, and that's why they're speaking out. But this can also happen at a very micro or local level. For instance, it could happen, my dad, my mom, my spouse, they don't see me for who I am. Therefore, I feel unloved, I feel unheard, I feel unworthy. So when we're talking about protests, we have to understand one really important thing here. And that is, while there's anger, and that's what we're seeing, that's the reaction that we're seeing, at the very base of this, above all else, there's a great sadness, a sorrow that is happening here. We can't demonstrate this through crying. That doesn't get us anywhere. So oftentimes that anger is what leads us into these protests. But we have to keep this in mind as we are engaging and talking about this sort of thing. So this lack of acknowledgement, right, of a person's voice is going to lead to conflict. And then that person or those people are going to begin to raise their voices. Next slide. And what ends up happening is that we're in this point where it's I'm right, you're wrong situation. And we hear this all the time, right? But if we stay here, where does this get us? Where do we go from here? maybe you guys have heard of things like conflict management or conflict resolution strategies to address conflict. And these are really useful, but the terminology themselves just alludes to, figuring out, how do we manage this conflict? There's this conflict, how do we just deal with it and kind of work through it? There's that kind of feeling towards it, not really deal with it. There's also conflict resolution, which can allude to potentially this idea that we rush to a solution really quickly without fully understanding the depth of this. And then there's this term that was coined in the 90s. It's called conflict transformation. And I want to spend some time really focusing on that today. Next slide. So when we're talking about conflict transformation, I just want to make that distinction. It's different from those other two. Not that those other two are bad. They're not. It's just there's this distinction in this moment here where it seeks to learn from and change, transform. It's about collaboration with one another. It's about finding a real solution and attempting to understand the conflict at hand. It focuses on resolving conflicts and tensions through addressing those misconceptions, building those relationships, and finding a common ground between groups and nations and individuals. What it also does is it includes efforts to redress inequities, and that can be racial or ethnic inequities. It can address others, but they do so, or we do so, through restorative justice, or sometimes through reparations. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to cover 5 strategies that we can use or that we can consider as we engage with people at both the macro, the large global level, as well as those micro levels, the local levels. And my hope is that this helps you to sort through what we're experiencing right now as a nation, as well as what our own interpersonal relationships maybe need or desire, and how we can impact those people that we love and those relationships that we love as well. All right, so for this first strategy, what we need to do is to recognize, first and foremost, that all of us have biased perceptions. And these can easily become egocentric or ethnocentric when we're in conflict. So just so that we're all on the same page, a bias is a prejudice in favor or against a thing or a person. I want to be really clear because it says for or against. Oftentimes we think about biases as being something that's negative. I'm against a person. And a lot of people, they think, well, I don't have any biases. I'm not doing anything bad or negative against another person. And maybe you're not. But maybe you're treating people relatively well, but you're treating other people better because you like them. And that is a bias too. So note that there's differences here. I can be biased in preference towards people who share my religious views. I can be biased against people who differ from my political preferences, and I can be biased even against people who wear clothing brands or wear certain clothing brands. And it doesn't matter, right? We all have biases. So let me say that one more time. Every single one of us has some kind of bias for something, a person, a group. It's there. That's within, innate in our human psyches. But it's how we handle or engage those biases and whether or not we're even aware of them that causes us these problems. Because when we're in conflict, we enter this fight-flight mode. And when we think we're in the right, that fight mode comes into play. I'm gonna step up, right? But what happens in those fight modes sometimes is these egocentric views come into play where I personalize everything and make it all about me. I could listen to the things that you say, and you say one thing that I now am feeling defensive about, and then I make it all about me. And that's egocentric, because at this point, I can't hear your perspective anymore. I'm not really listening, and that's problematic. And the same thing goes when we kind of fall in this ethnocentric area here, where maybe something comes out of my mouth like, that's crazy, that's stupid, that's weird, because that's not the way we normally do things around here. This idea that my way is somehow better, or my way is the only way, and I can't even understand how you could even have another perspective on this way, is really on the edge of ethnocentrism. And both of these block understanding and block hearing another person's perspective. And as I tell my students in my comm classes all of the time, our perspective is 100% our own reality, but it's not necessarily, and chances are it's just not, the reality of the person sitting right next to you. So we need to think about these things. We need to overcome them, become aware of them, and that's the best way that we can now enter into dialogue with others and really engage when we address them and acknowledge that those biases exist. Okay, so next slide. The second strategy here is to, when we're engaging in conflict, to attempt to avoid escalation of the conflict by resorting to threats. A very quick primal response that we have is often to resort to conflict with aggression, to try to suppress it. We don't like what you're saying. I don't like what you're saying to me right now, so I'm going to get louder than you, or I'm going to somehow try to stop you from talking, or suppress with force in some way, shape, or form. According to the Marshall Project, which is a social justice advocacy group, there has been approximately 50 years of research on violence when it comes to protests. And specifically, there were actually 3 federal commissions formulated between the years 1967 through 1970. And all 3 of these concluded that when police escalate in force, and when we're talking about force, we're talking about either weapons, tear gas, and sometimes in some instances, it's related to mass arrests. Those efforts often create the very violence that the force was meant to protect. And in a specific example, the Kerner Commission of 1967, which was created to investigate urban riots, found that out of the 24 riots that they investigated, 12 were actually started by police action in the use of force. So the concluding recommendation at the end of that was to attempt to try to eliminate some of those abrasive policing tactics, particularly when those original complaints were against police in the first place. And so we have to understand that we're seeing this right now, but this also goes beyond that macro level. I mean, even in our everyday conflicts, when someone gets aggressive, the problem is only exacerbated. It's not solved, right? We're just getting louder and yelling over each other. We're not listening to one another. We're standing on separate corners of the street yelling at each other. I can raise my voice and yell at you and you're gonna yell back, or you could be silent and not respond and later get back at me with passive aggressiveness. It just doesn't solve problems, it doesn't work. All right, the third strategy is to try and resist and avoid this us versus them mentality that often comes when we are engaged in conflict. And this is incredibly easy when you're in that I'm right, you're wrong mindset, to fall into this type of binary. What can happen in these moments is it can extend itself to not only I'm right, you're wrong, but it can extend itself to I'm good, we are good, and you are evil. And that can happen really quickly if you aren't careful. And that can happen whether you're righteous and there's a reason for your anger. And that can happen if there is no reason for your anger. It can happen on all sides, is essentially what I'm trying to say. We all know that we shouldn't stereotype, but it's in this particular area of conflict where it's easiest for those stereotypes and those generalizations to really take root. And actually, Dr. Faykosh yesterday in another discussion, he kind of brought this out where he said, it's interesting because if a person were to maybe ask or advocate and say, I really feel like maybe the police department does need a little bit of reform, that somebody else might say, well, you must be a police hater. Or if someone says, and they're stating, Black Lives Matter, they may fear that they're going to be condemned for not caring for all lives or other lives. And in this case, they might not speak up. They might silence themselves as a result of this dichotomy, this binary that's occurring, because this is tribalism. And if you don't know that term, tribalism, it's when a person or people, they don't stray from those behaviors or those attitudes of their core group. And that's a problem, because if we only act or react from these self-proclaimed binaries, again, we never solve the problem. How are we able to have dialogue if we stay within this, you're either with us or against us mentality? How can transformation really occur? But I want to take a minute, because I want to be very careful not to oversimplify this, because that could happen too. In this situation right now, there are deep hurts at play, and there's a lack of trust all around. So it's okay to be wary. no matter what side, you happen to be on. It's okay. But please note that, if we aren't very careful, when we end up making people seem like they are wrong or in some ways dehumanized, this then can justify our aggression, and that's a really, really dangerous place. So how do we overcome this? Really, it's a personal level, it's a local level. Maybe it's finding those places of similarity with one another. And it could be as simple as, hey, you and I both go to Central Arizona College, so yeah, we're disagreeing on this moment, but we've got that, right? Or maybe it's, I agree that we all need to maintain our freedoms, and you agree that on that too. Maybe we're in different positions as to why or how, but we're proud to be Americans, and so there's that. Or maybe it's, hey, we both play Zelda Breath of the Wild on the Switch. I mean, like, it doesn't even matter what it is. It's finding that similarity, because what that does is it humanizes the other person. It makes them real again. It's not just some person over there that you hate anymore, right? It's a real human being. And that's essential if we're wanting to overcome and really transform in our conflict. Okay, next slide. Strategy number 4 really is asking us to look below the surface and to really consider some of the deeper issues or concerns that are at play. And I really like this visual. This visual does a lot for me. Hopefully it works for you guys too. But this idea of the iceberg where, for instance, George Floyd, he was a catalyst. He's at the top of this iceberg here, but there's so much more below this. Dr. Faykosh shared with us in the historical perspective, and we saw there's just so much history. There's so much beneath the surface that maybe not all of us are aware of or know about. So I heard this today in some of my social media. Well, they arrested all 4 of the police officers, so now the protest should be over now, right? Everybody should be happy. But you're missing the point then, because that's just the surface, right? It's not just about George Floyd. It's about so much more. It's about all the inequities. It's about all the things that have occurred in the past. It's that below, that beneath the surface, that's really the issue. I mean, the Titanic, right, was taken out by what was below the surface, not what was above. And we can get taken out if we're not paying attention. This nation needs to pay attention to what's below the surface in this particular moment. And maybe it's, being at lectures like this where you learn a little bit of the history, or maybe it's something that you have to research on your own. And here's the thing, you shouldn't be ashamed that you don't know these things, because in some ways it wasn't taught. And maybe we have to seek these out in our own time and our own speed, and just take that time, and that's really what we're asking. But also, do we understand that history? And this is personal to me, because I was thinking about this, and I wanted to share a personal example from my life. So my son, he just graduated from 6th grade, and he's really been watching and paying attention to what's happening in our nation. And he asked, can we do something, Mom? And what he wanted to do was he wanted to memorialize those who have been murdered before they were allowed to go to the court of law, as Joe would have described it, Dr. Faykosh described it. And so I said, yeah, let's do that. So we made this poster where we said in memory of, and we found all of the names, and I wrote a name, and he wrote a name, and I wrote a name, and he wrote a name, and we continued on, over 100 names written on this poster. And it wasn't until I was writing those names, because I did recognize some of them, but the majority of them I did not. And yes, I was aware that people are being murdered, all African Americans are being murdered. It wasn't until I was writing the names and thinking about every family who was impacted by this. And that's when I had an understanding, right? And sometimes it takes those moments to really be able to get at that history and really feel what's beneath that surface. Next slide, strategy 5. This last strategy here is asking us to separate the sacred from the pseudo-sacred. Is everything really non-negotiable? And maybe this doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you, but I'll give you 2 examples. And the first one is related to what's happening right now. So the destruction of buildings and businesses is terrible and incredibly sad. But is it more sacred than the lives of those who've been lost unjustly? Only for the reason that their skin color may be different? Or here's another example. Maybe let's put it in the pandemic. My freedoms and my choice, that is core to being an American citizen, right? It's part of our values. But are my freedoms and my choice to wear a mask, in my mind, as I have to think about this, is that more important than helping to potentially, and maybe it doesn't even help, but potentially protect the health and the lives of those in my community? So it's not to say that these things aren't important, but rather that in this moment, in this time, is this where my focus needs to be? It's really about making that reflection for yourself, considering these things before you speak, before you assert your opinion, to reflect in that moment. Maybe that time comes at a later date, right? But in this moment, is this what matters most? What's sacred? What's only partially sacred, right? So all of these techniques, they lead us to one main point. And that is, next slide, we need to listen. Then we need to demonstrate that we actually listened. And I'm sure you all have heard about the officer in Flint, Michigan, who not only laid down his weapons, but he asked a question to those who were protesting. He said, what would you like us to do? And they said, walk with us. And he did. And that was a demonstration that I hear you, I'm listening, we are a community. We are the community's police, right? And you see this when people are taking a knee. And you also see other violence across. So you're seeing all these different images they're coming across. And it's important that we listen, but we also have to understand that one act, it was wonderful that this police officer did this, and we hope that there's more dialogue in this manner, but it has to be more than just that one time, right? One act doesn't wipe it all away, all the hurts, all the anger. It needs to be continual. It needs to, that conversation needs to keep happening, and actions need to keep occurring in order for us to continue on and really be in true dialogue and really solve the problems that are at hand here. It's not just one time. So what I'd like to do in this next slide is address people who are white, like me, not a person of color, who I can't pretend to understand fully what it's like to be a person of color in the United States. But I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'm hoping that this can be some guidance for those who, like me, really want to do something of worth and want to stand alongside our brothers and sisters of color. And I'm personally taking this to heart, and that's why I wanted to share this with you all, besides the fact that it's just good communication practice, so there's that. But it's to read the signals, and I like this image because it's easy and it's good to remember, where we need to just stop for a moment. And when people of color are sharing their experiences, that we really listen, that we don't interrupt and say, oh yeah, but, or, well, my friend who is also Black, or, well, at least you, and we're interrupting. Because if you remember what I said earlier, when we aren't heard, we don't feel loved. And in that moment, you're not demonstrating love. Sometimes it's good to just be quiet and hear and acknowledge. And the second thing we can do is amplify those messages that are shared with us. You know, we were not here to speak for people. No, that's not our jobs, all right? But we can amplify those thoughts, those ideas, so that they're heard in their own voices. And then the last thing is that we shouldn't remain silent. We need to speak. And when we do witness an injustice, or we do have an opportunity to educate, that we take that opportunity and we speak up. I've been trying to be very cognizant of being quiet in this time and being still and paying attention and really listening to the traumas really that people have been experiencing. But I know that I do have a role as a communication studies PhD person, right, that has some knowledge, and I do need to share that, and it would be wrong of me if I didn't. And so there are some times when you should speak as well, because that is an exercise of love. So if you didn't quite catch all of this, I hope you caught that all of these techniques, all of these strategies are about, how do I stop? How do I listen? How do I pay attention to my perceptions, my biases, and my anger in these moments? And this is for all of us, every human being on this earth, right? We all need to be doing this. Because if your goal is to be angry for anger's sake, then you know what, these strategies, these techniques, they're just going to be useless to you. But if your goal is to bridge that gap, to collaborate, to understand, and to try to transform this conflict into something better so that we solve these problems, we move through these problems, then hopefully this is a good start. It's not gonna get us there, but it's a good start. And I believe that, you know, we'll begin to be able to see positive transformations in not only our communities, but even in our personal relationships. And there's nothing better than that. So I just want to thank you so much for being here and letting us speak on this. I'm going to hand this back over to Joe here.
All right, and Dr. Span wasn't able to come on as a panelist, but I do have him here on the phone, so we're gonna try this out and make sure you're able to hear him. He's got some words to share, so I have him on the speaker on my phone, so we're gonna see if this works. Go ahead, Derrick.
Thank you for inviting me. I had a PowerPoint when I was asked to do this. You know, I was told from my experience as an African American. We all know it's very difficult and trying times. It makes me be reminded of the voice of the souls of Black folk. We have a kind of double nature, both American on the one hand and African American on the other hand. One in which we try to be patriotic, and on the other hand, we have to protect ourselves from abuse and discrimination of the like. I just want to say that over the last year, this has been a particularly difficult year for me personally. I have had a number of experiences over the last few months, the last part of this year, and I do understand what it feels like to have an act and symbolic experience, symbolically lynched. I know what it feels like to be characterized. And there are times I've had to go inside my office to gather myself because I couldn't breathe. Bullshit, loneliness, hung in the air. I feel like cannot. I've had those. I understand that this
Joe, we can't hear him.
Yeah, Derrick, you're cutting out a little bit. I'm so sorry.
And as we get watch his funeral today, all of the funeral, there's a great deal of attention at the beginning. All of a sudden, the sounds are gone, the lights are gone, the cameras are gone. People are left alone. Me and many that look like only the spotlight attention of the world is based on the Dodge Street. These cameras leave. I go back to my status as one of the subjects. And so it is a very sort of a dual feeling now. So feeling as a witness and trying to watch people demonstrate across the nation feel that those two viruses out there. I get up and say, oh, my mask to go out to face one virus. The spotlight is over, and I have to put on those masks to face one virus, and then I have to face another virus. Another virus, and both of them act the same way. So, the things I have been very satisfied with the unified mind, all of them, and my students, young people, both black and white, male, female, all of each other to lay a tone of the United States to say, the revolution of truth now must come down and take a look at the issue of brutality and say, you're not right. Take a look at their issue of not right. So there's something moving in the country now that wasn't before, that teenagers and young people should also know. I've never known about rape before. But there's not been a 17-year-old who stood and took shots that captivated the world. Once again, it's been young people, students, who we think all the time are really paying attention to all this. Young people have changed come out of this. Only because of the churches work. Consciousness, courage of young people who are on the side. Many of them have had college and stuff. I just want to take a moment and the last thing, my last point I want to make is one of the interesting things that really Floyd did just before he died, and that was called on his mother. There's been a references to Dr. Floyd. He also know that his mother was shot while playing the organ in a church, and Floyd was calling that pain and suffering for a grown man to reach out to his mother who's deceased. But I know that even all too well, struggled with the panel's gate, struggled with what I said. I couldn't call colleagues that. I couldn't call friends. I called my mother and asked her, what should I say? What should I do? And I found a great deal of strength. And so I want to say you to the painful moment, years, experiences that I've had. I'm just hoping that someone, somehow, will be that grand day. We all can finally say enough of this brutality, enough of this injustice, and make a declaration that never again anybody has to say, I can't. Thank you.
Thanks, Derrick. And again, we're sorry about the sound issues. We wanted to limit it so that we wouldn't get Zoom bombed, is what they call it. But unfortunately, that also means that the sound quality is kind of compromised. Tramaine, would you like to speak? I'm sure you have some thoughts as well. Dr. Rausaw is our Dean of Students.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Sandy, for hosting this, this seminar and workshop presentation for our community. I don't have much to say other than what's already been said, through your own presentation and your own thoughts about things. But I do just want to say to our students that are participating with us, I want to thank you for attending and joining in the session with us, as well as our faculty and staff that are on. But to our students especially, we want you to know that we take very seriously into consideration what's going on across the world and in this country, and we recognize how difficult it could be for you being students, and oftentimes students feel very helpless in certain situations. But what we're seeing is that our young people especially are being hit very hard by this, and they're taking it to heart. And that is encouraging because if nothing else, we've seen historically how it can be young people that can really change the world and change history and set us on a movement and a path forward that really creates a better world for us. So I want to encourage you as our students to continue to call out injustice when you see it, and be the leaders that you set yourself out to be, that you know you can be. And sometimes that means challenging people that may be older than you, challenging those who may be set in their ways. But you are the future that we have to look forward to. And I thank so many of you for taking the initiative to jump on when some of you may be off for the summer. Some of you may be in summer school right now. But this is a very interesting time in the world, and really for our nation. And I've seen, a lot of people on social media have said, well, we're not experiencing those same problems in Arizona, and it's not that bad here. It doesn't matter where this one incident happened. The history is there, and the hurt is widespread and widely felt. And it doesn't matter where any one incident occurs. The ramifications and the ripple effects of that incident. And like Dr. Rath was saying, this is really the tip of the iceberg, that one incident. These are deeply rooted issues that have to be resolved, and they can't be resolved overnight. It's a long process, a very long process. But I do find a lot of solace and comfort in knowing that we have the ability to love one another a lot better, and we have the ability to make some very important and crucial and positive changes so that these incidents do not continue to occur in the way that they have. But I definitely want to thank again Drs. Faykosh and Rath for putting this on. I was so excited when they reached out about redoing this presentation that was very successful in the past. So thank you to you two for leading this effort for us. I won't take up too much more time. I'm not sure if you guys want to get into any questions from the chat or anything, but I just want to say thank you to everybody that is in attendance.
Yes, thank you. And we will enter the question, sorry. I'll go through the questions, and any of you who haven't written a question, if you want us to weigh in on it, and then Tramaine and Sandy for sure jump in. I did see one that I wanted to address right off the top. Ed Peace wrote, why do you equate violence by adults who are tired of abuse by police with a temper tantrum by a small child? It's a demeaning and inappropriate comparison. I misspoke if that's the way that it came out. It was not my intention. But I think the way that Dr. Rath articulated it was much better when she said primal, frustration is a kind of primal impulse. And that is for sure the way I meant to say it. I think we see a lot when people say, well, I wouldn't protest like that, or that's not how I grieve. And what I wanted to say, or what I tried to say and maybe was inarticulate about, is the fact that we all have that frustration within us. We all have breaking points. And what we're seeing is people processing things at a different time. And what I really hope we can get past is kind of policing one another in terms of saying, well, I wouldn't do it that way, so it's not a right way to grieve. As Dr. Rath pointed out, we do seem to hold property at a different value than human life. And So that is something that I'm seeing a lot of. And we also are very big on feeling like the way that we process is the only good way. I'm guilty of that. Clearly, I'm guilty of that in some ways. And so we can all be better about that. And that's what I tried to get across, Ed. So I'm sorry for making that comparison. I just meant the kind of primal urge to be frustrated. Dr. Rath or Tramaine, if you want to add anything on that one. Good. The other question is, I can see you, Sandy, so I'm just going to assume. Any idea what the protesters want? The same issues have been covered over the years and no resolve. And this is from anonymous attendee. You know, I think it changes, and there is one thing that I've been having conversations with different people about is the idea that we're not a monolith. We're not a monolith as a country. We have over 350 million people with 350 million personal desires, inequities that we see, things that affect us in different ways. And when we see these protests, what you're seeing is where a lot of those feelings line up and get us where we're all on the same page. You know, this month we're all celebrating Pride Month, right? And the idea that now 51 years ago, you know, the LGBTQ community was able to protest. They had felt marginalized for so long. This incident in a bar in New York City galvanized that movement to the point that that they were able to all kind of come together. And since then, you know, that movement has only grown, and we've seen so much progress. That didn't mean that that wasn't there before, that those tensions weren't bubbling. It just means that there's a catalyst, that there's an aligning of purpose and leaders in the movement. And I see that with this, right? I think some of the people on the street are pushing for police reform. Some people are pushing for certainly there to be better expression of social inequality and discriminatory practices in our healthcare and in our housing and in other underlying issues. And so it would be a mistake to say it's all, you know, one thing that once we get it, it'll all be good. I don't think that's going to happen. And so that's, I guess, as good as I can try to answer that. Dr. Rath or Dr. Rausaw?
No, I felt that you really articulated that well, that it isn't a monolith, and there are so many reasons that people are out and protesting, and really it's about those inequities. Not inequity is different than equality. So people aren't, maybe there's equal, but what about inequity? I mean, can we all reach the same goals truthfully, where we stand and where we were born into? And I think that's part of what needs to be addressed in some way. Do I have the solution? I wish I did, but I don't.
Next question. There are white individuals, protecting their stores in New York with huge guns openly carried. Why is it such a threat when a Black person practices the same right to bear arms? I think that's a really great question. This is from anonymous attendee. And that's one that I've kind of wrestled with as well. When we saw a couple weeks ago the protesters in Lansing, in Columbus, and all over the country, and those people being celebrated for speaking up, feeling oppressed, and doing something about it. I cannot imagine. I want you all to picture right now if the protesters outside the White House on Monday night, if they were carrying guns, whatever the weapons that the same protesters in Lansing had, it would have been a completely different story. And I think it goes to some of these kind of underlying tensions that we've been talking about, where you know, that there is this kind of systemic quality to the way that people see threat and what we're told to be scared of, and what we've kind of been, I don't want to say indoctrinated, but what we've been led to believe throughout our lives are the real threats. Dr. Rath or Dr. Rausaw?
Yeah, I would agree with you, Joe, in that it just seems to be just so deeply rooted in history and culture and what we're taught and how we're brought up and just how we perceive the world. It's just very interesting and different because oh geez, it's I don't know how to explain that. That's a tough question, but I can't pinpoint it to any one thing other than it's just so deeply rooted. There are just so many underlying causes and issues with that, but there is a general fear of the Black culture in some fashion, and that goes back many years. And I don't know, maybe one day that won't be the case, but right now, unfortunately, it is. And that's just one of the many reasons I think people are protesting the way that they are. It would be one of those many reasons that people go out to speak out about inequity and injustice and racial profiling and racism. It's a very sad situation.
Chief Roberts had a comment. You pointed out how many African Americans were killed by police since 2015. You did not mention what crimes those who were killed were or had committed. Also, if you have how many police officers were killed in the line of duty while protecting the public. I agree with the presentation and need for police reform, but in fairness, both sides of facts should be presented. And that's a completely valid point, Chief Roberts, and I thank you for that. What I wanted to, in terms of presenting that image and the graph that went with it, was the idea that this is what this specific protest is about. And I don't want to say that I endorse one way or the other. This is definitely a topic that I know you said you were open to discussing when we all talked last night. And if we can have a forum in the future about what police reform would look like, I think that would be a really kind of valuable discussion. And certainly, I think that's a question that we all wrestle with. What does protect and serve look like versus some of these other kinds of topics for protest or discussion. And I don't want to invalidate the protesters who are seeing it in, I guess, those stark terms. So yes, I think both sides should be presented. And if we were to do a much longer presentation about that issue in particular, that is definitely something that I would hope to balance. And if you have the resources that we could post with this content, then that would be great as well. Dr. Rath or Dr. Rausaw? All right, we have another question. Is your takeaway that we should listen, speak when we witness injustice and echo the experiences of people of color to try and bridge the divide? And this is from Heinz Valensky. Thank you for that question. I think Dr. Rath had, the signal, the reason that we still have that image up is it's a really kind of important one to take away, that, and it's difficult, right? I get paid to talk. I get paid to share my ideas. Dr. Rath and I are friends on Facebook, so she gets to see my somewhat unvarnished thoughts as they're being processed. Believe it or not, I try to be more thoughtful than I am. Sometimes you have to take yourself out of the equation, right? And I think Dr. Rath really did speak to that idea. Think about what you are adding, and if you're all kind of taking away from the person who's speaking, and recognize, certainly the idea that you have a platform, but that doesn't mean you have to use it all the time. And that's something that I try to be better about, and I think the people in leadership throughout our country right now can really do better about. In terms of amplifying and echoing the experiences, I think this is about respect, right? And making sure that people feel like their stories are being heard and that they're being validated. And that is just a basic living in a society 101 kind of thing that we can all, I think, get better about. Dr. Rath?
Yeah, and I would just add, while these are definitely great strategies, I don't know that it's going to completely bridge that divide. And to think about, how do I put this in my everyday lived experiences? You know, I can certainly come up here and preach about this, but what am I doing every day to really hear and really see people? And, you know, I think about it with, you know, people at work and our colleagues at work who maybe have addressed some inequities and have shared things. Have I listened? Have I really paid attention? Am I doing anything to stand alongside of those individuals? If it's, you know, in my community, my neighbors, my own family members, and in what ways have I really shown and demonstrated that I'm with you? And I think we need to reflect on that for some of us, and consider those places uniquely to us that we can really demonstrate that.
Tramaine?
Yeah, I would agree with what Dr. Rath just said, and also acknowledge that everyone has different comfort levels and how far they may go to, you know, speak out or do something that can help make some positive changes. But no matter what your comfort level is, there's still something that everybody can do, and I would never be the person that tells everybody go out and protest and everybody, you know, round up your closest, you know, friends of color and ask them how they're doing. But there's something on a huge scale of things that you can do that can inch us forward. And if everyone would just take even a small step in taking some action, it would get us very far in battling these issues. So I would encourage everybody to just think about that.
Thank you. Chief Roberts has responded, there is a need for police reform across the country. Some areas are very bad and need lots of work. And I think that's a great way to kind of summarize that. And to, again, be balanced, trying to be balanced, Chief Roberts, there's a need all over, right? It's not just the police. You know, I think we're all grateful for what you do to kind of keep the CAC community together, and I know that you really mean what you say, and that's very well appreciated. And whatever we can do to kind of help in the endeavor, I think that would be really great too. So if you have ideas, let us know. Pat Weaver asks, can you briefly review the 5 strategies we can adopt and practice? And Dr. Rath, I'll let you walk us through that again if you're so willing.
No problem. So the first one, real quick, is basically just to avoid biases and to check those biases, to recognize where they occur. The second one, if you don't mind switching the slides because I don't remember them in order. The second one is, yeah, to avoid aggression and going to that primal instinct. It might happen initially, but how do I hold that back, and maybe even as leaders, for those who are in leadership positions, to recognize that the suppression of voices and the suppression of people's expressions actually ends up ending poorly in most situations. The next one was about, I think it was the us versus them strategy. So to avoid those binaries and making it about I'm good, you're evil, where it can easily come into play, or that, you know, you're either with us or against us kind of mentality is what the third strategy was. The fourth strategy was to ask to look at what's beneath the surface, to maybe look back at history and find out what are the real reasons behind this. And I think that that is really going to be helpful in terms of figuring out why as to why people are upset or angry or saddened. And then the fifth strategy is to really pay attention and to reflect on what really is most important in that time and in that space and in that particular conflict. This can go, understand all these strategies, they don't have to be only about protests. I mean, this is for across the board, even in your interpersonal relationships. So to really, do I want to argue this right now? Is this the time? Is this the place? Is this what's most important? Or do they need something else from me? And do I really reflect on what is the most important in this space, in this time, what is most sacred? And so those are the brief review of those 5 strategies.
Awesome. And if any of you have any other questions, certainly feel free to shoot us. One thing I forgot, Dr. Rath, is that we did have resources. I wanted to give you a chance to walk through a few of your resources, and then I have a few to add as well.
Basically, I just included a couple of resources. They're good websites to go forward and look at if you're interested in intercultural dialogue and how to bridge the differences. These are great websites to look at, and some of them are directly addressing some of the protests right now. Some of them are still more focused on COVID-19 and, you know, the conversations that are coming about. Some of them are addressing all of them, but these are great places and spaces if you're interested in looking into more of this and some more resources. They have a lot of resources on these websites.
For mine, I wanted to share, I'm a historian again, this is a reminder. JSTOR put out a series on institutionalized racism. When you click on it, let's see if it opens up. I don't know if it'll go straight there. But, well, type in JSTOR and then institutionalized racism. It's rare that JSTOR gives you access to their articles for free, just FYI, but they are, and that's really awesome. And it runs the gamut. You get to see insights from historians from dozens of years talking about incidences that, you know, I myself had not heard about or haven't read up on. And so it is an invaluable resource right now. Some really great articles there. And then I saw the images that you're seeing at the bottom from a colleague who was linking from, and I don't know the details on Victoria Alexander, but apparently she was asked multiple times, what should I be reading, or how can I be a better ally? And so she shared her, what she calls anti-racist lit starter kit. And then as you get more into it, you can really get into some compelling ideas. I won't talk about all of the books, but I can tell you about a few of the ones that I have read and am impacted by. Certainly A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, where he tries to kind of cut through the textbook industry that many of you are really familiar with, where we tell the same narratives and don't really get underneath. The same is about Lies My Teacher Told Me. That's another great book that kind of looks at stories that, about people who are marginalized or don't always get their stories told. I have the book So You Want to Talk About Race and White Fragility, and in both cases, they're really good about having those conversations that maybe some of us shy away from. There is certainly one of the most celebrated books of the last few years is Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, as well as Isabel Wickerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. James Baldwin had a movie a couple years ago that read through a lot of his poems, and so several of his books are on this list as well. And we also have Evicted, which is going to be getting at some of these underlying kind of issues that undergird a lot of the protests that we're seeing. And so, you know, there are all sorts of books that you can kind of get into. A couple of you have asked us to share this presentation, and I'll see about how we can do that, just so that everybody can have access. I know we kind of had to go through some content really trying to get at some of these topics in a way that, we wouldn't be here all night, but I'm sure we'd love to have conversations about this in the weeks and months to come. So certainly stay tuned. We just had another question. This is from Karen Kimball. This is, I think, addressed to Chief Roberts. Will he please address the specific ways the CAC police work to collaborate and listen to students of color? I'm going to let Chief Roberts, if he wants to respond to that. I don't know if he's still on the line here. And again, Chief Roberts, the question, and feel free if you want to answer this at a different time. But the question is, address specific ways the CAC police work to collaborate and listen to students of color. And while he's working on that,
I just allow him to talk, I think. So can you talk?
Let's see if we can. Yes. Great. Chief Roberts, can you try talking into?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
And you guys are all high tech now.
Oh, great. Yay.
Are we perfect? No, but are we trying to open communication and dialogue? Yes, we are. How we started off the bat was we had to look at ourselves in the mirror. We were lacking training, the department here, for bias and diversity, hate crimes, that type of stuff. So we had to look in-house and improve our training. That also included teaching our officers how to do community projects. And one of the things every officer here is assigned, they have to do a community project with somebody at CAC. And I don't want to get into all the projects the officers done because they were going to present them right before the COVID stuff started. But as far as with minorities, a great deal of our students that are minorities are athletes. And so what we've done working with athletic director and coaches have offered to have private conversations and frank conversations where we could exchange information, because a lot of times it's just perceptions. An example, some of the track athletes who are from other countries were deathly afraid of police, and they would walk away from us when we walked by them. And it was making me uncomfortable. And finally, I just started sitting down in the cafeteria and talking to them and asking them what the problem is. And they explained to me where they come from. Police, they're afraid of police because they assault them, and they were afraid to approach police. And it's just a lot of it's perception and open and dialogue. And one of the things I've directed all the officers to do is more of a community policing approach. And I don't care where they're at in campus. If I want them saying hello, good morning, and trying to begin dialogue with people. Another thing that I've started, which it bugs me that more of the professors don't take advantage of it. Myself and my officers, my favorite thing to do is to go guest speak in classes. And I have opened it up since day one here. If you invite me to your class, students can ask me anything they want. They might not like my response, but they're not going to hurt my feelings. And I believe in open communication so we can come to a common understanding. As far as a bunch of the various advisory groups or councils, I've been asking everybody in the academic world, how come there's no police officers from this police department on any committee here, besides the ones I'm on as a police chief? There's a lot of various committees that I would love for my officers to be on. And, I hate breaking down ethnic background for a police department, but we're a small police department with only 19 people. And we are an extremely diverse police department if you look at our racial breakdown. So I hope I answered the question a little bit. I hate doing this on a microphone. I like doing it in person. But we're just trying to open communication up. And so people feel comfortable speaking with us. All students, doesn't matter who they are, and all faculty.
Thank you, Chief Roberts. And just to kind of go along with that, I know that I believe it was the fall, you and Dr. Span did a panel together. It might have been right before the break. And so I do know that you have really kind of tried to be kind of in front of some of these topics and some of these issues. And I think we've done a pretty good job of advertising some of these events, but definitely keep your eyes peeled for when there's some of these topics going on. Anybody else want to, oh, sorry.
Can I brag about one of my officers and Dr. Span on that panel? So that was actually one of my officers that chose to do that as her community project, her community engagement. And I was very proud of her taking on a very hard subject like that. But that's the thing we're trying to promote with the officers.
Yes, I think very well.
There is some questions in the chat box, so they didn't get to the question and answer portion. Okay. There's one from Thomas who says, if these police officers are not convicted to the fullest extent that they have been charged with, there will be more rioting and demonstrations, just like with Rodney King. What steps can be taken to address this? And I think that is a really telling question, and one that I think a lot of us are wondering about as well. What is going to happen? And I won't proclaim that I know the answers to this, but I would argue that if there's some moves prior to that, because I'm assuming that these are going to take a while. I mean, that's generally how the court system works. It takes sometimes years to get things going. That in that meantime, if there are moves for some reform, if there are actual policy changes and actions that have taken place to show and demonstrate that, yes, change needs to occur, I'm guessing that there would be maybe less backlash or less of a visceral response in that manner. To some extent, I was in a discussion yesterday with a retired police chief, and something really struck me with what he said. And he said, that it really comes down to leadership in a lot of situations, and the leadership of a police department, for instance. You have a leader who maybe is more of a mindset that is the police department is the community's police department. And in those moments that there seems to be more engagement and more listening happening. And then there's some that are led by those who it's the chief of police or the sheriff's police department, and it's not the community so much. And that's where some of the tensions are coming in, and those kinds of led departments, I guess you could say. And if there's shifts in maybe the training in some of the leadership here, because it comes top down in anything. A lot of this is top down. And so if we see moves from the top, whether it's in the police department, whether it's in the Senate, whether it's in our local government here, or whether it's in Washington, that's where we begin to feel like there may be something that is changing here. If there aren't any changes before that, yeah, I would say that, yeah, we're going to see that. We're going to see people very upset. I don't know. Joe, do you have things to add?
Yeah, I would just say, and I think you said it was from Thomas. I'm not able to find the question in here, but yeah, I just thought, sorry. So I've been thinking a lot about that, Thomas, and especially the idea that, as I talked about with the idea of lynchings, if we believe in the justice system and we want it to work for everybody, you should want those police officers to get a fair trial. And what I worry about is the idea of making sure that that is felt, right? Anybody from my history classes know we talk about the Boston Massacre, so back in 1770, and the colonists wanted to prove that we believe in justice and we'll give them a fair trial here in the United States. So they got John Adams to be the lawyer so that he was able to guarantee, like, I'm an American colonist, and so my loyalty is split, right? I believe in justice, but I also believe in this movement. But that's where that tension comes. And so for those officers, I do believe that we have a responsibility to make sure that they do get a fair trial and that they get the justice that was denied Ahmaud, denied George, denied Trayvon, denied all of these other people who've been accused of things and didn't get a chance to defend themselves or be defended in court. And I have the same worry, Thomas, that that if the sentencing isn't what we want, isn't what we think is right, that we'll be right back here before too long. And so that is definitely something kind of weighing on me. And I guess that's where we should be pushing really for making sure that it isn't just the police officers. In many cases, they're the front line of laws that are being written and that they have to enforce. And maybe they don't want to, but that's what they signed up for, right? And so, you can also be pressuring your congressmen. You can be pressuring your city councils. You can be going after the people who are making some of those laws changed to reflect what you see as overreach by the police and by the government at large.
This Chief Roberts, I just want to say I think Dr. Rath was spot on with leadership and how the rank and file take on the demeanor of their leadership. That was a really good answer.
It wasn't mine. I stole that. That was from a retired police chief, so I stole that.
Well, it's true, and it's good and bad, because when you see strong leadership and weak leadership, one of the worst things I've ever seen in police work, what I tell people, is when you have a police chief that's political. It doesn't matter which side of the spectrum they're on. The police chief and the police departments represent the people. They don't represent the Republicans or the Democrats or special interest groups. It's my belief that you represent what's right and wrong, and you're a part of the community. But I just want to turn that question on all of you. Another fear I have is, let's say the officers are convicted and they get whatever the maximum sentences are. Are we going to have protests that turn violent, and celebration protests that turn violent? And what I'm referring to is, think of all the sporting events, national championships and Super Bowl victories in the sports world. What happens when their team wins? Chicago's a good example of what they experienced with the Chicago Bulls when they were winning all the championships. So I think there's going to have to be preparation for a verdict either way, to be quite honest. It's going to be scary. Something is going to happen.
I definitely agree, Chief Robert. I went to Ohio State as an undergrad. And
I'm sorry.
no, I'm very proud of it. My freshman year, we won the national championship, and it was one of the first years that we beat Michigan 2 years in a row. And my parents had to call me because there's so much rioting happening in the streets. There were these people who were throwing couches out in the street and setting them on fire, and cars were overturned. And that was when we won games, so you can imagine the tumults. Luckily, we don't lose that often. So, but yeah. So definitely, I've seen that firsthand. And that is definitely something to kind of think about, and I also wrestle with the idea that I have a lot of friends who are big on not looking at prison as retribution and thinking about reforming the process. And so if you believe in that, what does justice actually look like for these officers? Is it being in a cell for the rest of their lives? And I don't know how we can talk about that same situation happening for everybody. If you believe in jail, you believe in jail. If you believe in there being restorative justice, that should be extended to everybody, not just because they're on your side of the issue. And Pat Weaver has a question about plea bargaining. I have to be honest, I don't know a lot about that topic to say anything specific, except that I do know that there is situations where people are induced to say that they're guilty of a crime to avoid getting a harsher sentence. And that is definitely something that we can be addressing. I don't know the particulars about what kind of, what the remedial steps are to changing that. If anybody else knows a little bit more. Dr. Rath, no?
Nothing.
Definitely something to think about, Pat. And
the specific incidents for the officers, or just in general?
I think it just says in general. So
Yeah, I can spend all day talking about the horrible plea bargain deals I've seen in my career on both sides of the spectrum. There's definite need for social reform there.
And maybe that is something we can do in the future, Chief Roberts, in terms of having another forum down the road, one that can look at some of these things as well. AC says he grew up in Ohio, says full blood's great, AC. I'm back in the wonderful Buckeye State, so getting to experience that right now. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. So I think we'll call it a day. Thank you all so much for being here and for contributing and listening, and hopefully carry this forward. If you're interested in getting the, I can type my email address into the, I can send you the PowerPoint presentation if you want some of those links. Otherwise, I'll talk with Angela, and if she's here, about maybe how we can, if people just direct their questions to me in order to get this content. But otherwise, Dr. Rath, if you want to say any closing thoughts.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for attending and for asking those questions and for being with us in this conversation today. I hope that it was some use to all of you. I know that it was cathartic to me in some ways, so I appreciate that, and just thank you all.
Dr. Rausaw?
I agree. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Carry it forward, everybody. We can be better in your own way. I keep saying the phrase, there isn't a panacea. There's not a one solution, but you got to find your way of contributing to make this better. So find that and try to devote your whole heart to it. Thank you all so much for coming, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yes, thank you.